When I was like 7 or 8 years old, I had a bus toy as well as this old castle toy that opened up. I know that sounds like a dollhouse, but it wasn't. It was manly, not a dollhouse. I've never been able to be happy with just normal things, so I opened up the castle, not a dollhouse, and put it on top of the bus, instantly turning it into a flying bus with wings. I loved my flying bus far more than the two toys it was made from. And I've never really lost that preference for weird things made up of parts that aren't supposed to go together. Or more simply, just things being used incorrectly in service of some greater goal. With that in mind, welcome to Sometimes it bums me out how many tracks I've started and abandoned, so the objective here is to feel less sad. The first step is to go back into old project files and save out all of the MIDI because MIDI can be worth its weight in gold as a resource. The second step is finding a way of sampling parts of all of these old MIDI files. I have this older version of Remedy that'll work perfectly for that, allowing me access to each individual track's MIDI from the selected project. I can turn tracks on and off, pitch everything up or down, speed up and slow down the playback, and control how large the sampled passages triggered by MIDI notes are. So tracks full of MIDI like this become sampleable like this. And yeah, it's bad. A whole track of MIDI like this is useless as is. Not only are things like drums being captured as off-scale notes, but I also want to be able to force these old performances into different keys as needed. That's where a scaler comes in. Not only does it have the ability to lock your MIDI to a specific key, but you can also add in some chords mute those chords from being sent to your instrument, and then map any incoming MIDI that lands on the white notes to the chords as they change. The only problem is that it's incredibly unlikely that all of the MIDI will land on the white notes unless you work exclusively in C major and A minor. But all that's needed is a second instance of scaler forcing everything into C major or A minor before our chord mapped scaler instance. There's one remaining issue though, and that's that Scalar 3 is new enough that the timing is kind of off when doing this. You probably noticed me starting for measure 2 and moving the chords back 1/16 of a note to work around that. I don't know how universal this problem is, but the good news is that pushing the trigger chords back like this causes it to work flawlessly for me. It's a good thing then that I stumbled across this solution right off the bat, and definitely before I went crazy coming up with a way of replicating the same chain in Scalar 2, because that would have been maddening. So Scalar 2 is harder to use like this because it only maps 2 octaves of white keys to the current chord rather than the whole keyboard like in Scalar 3. Notes outside of that 2-octave range play normally, which means that we'll be getting a whole lot of off-key notes without some drastic measures. And as a side effect of that, even if you manage to force every note into range, you'll still end up with a MIDI performance that doesn't span as much of the keyboard as the Scalar 3 version of the chain. But that's not necessarily a downside, just a slightly different result, and different results can be interesting in their own way. My MIDI files tend to cover a lot of the keyboard, with the drums filling out the low notes and the actual performances being up higher. After Remedy and Scalar 2, which here is mapping every note to the all-white note key of C major like in the previous chain, there's then an extra chain, which is where things start to get complicated. Here I'm mapping a couple of octaves above and below into range so that we're getting as many notes in range as reasonably possible. I did this by using this Reaper.js plugin called MIDI CC Mapper X to send each out-of-range octave to a different MIDI channel, then used MIDI tools to transpose notes in those specific octaves so that they're in range to be corrected by Scalar 2, with everything outside of that range being cold. This raises the possibility of some note overlaps, but sometimes instruments react to those in inspiring ways, so it's just another interesting side effect of this whole chain. I find that I really like this Scalar 2 version of the plugin chain on monophonic sounds. Finally, I have a plugin at the end of the chain to transpose the chord map MIDI up or down, so that way I can experiment with other octaves outside of the 2-octave range that's corrected by Scalar 2. In this version of the chain, transposing the MIDI and Remedy is more about getting the notes in range than determining what octave it plays in, so you have to do it after the correction, basically. It's worth mentioning that Scalar 2 doesn't have the arrange mode that's in Scalar 3, so you have to capture the MIDI and then drag it in and build out your chord progressions that way as your song changes over time. Another instance of Scalar 2 can capture the MIDI at the end of the chain and allow you to drag it into your project though. Both versions of Scalar have built-in performances that are much simpler to use than all of this craziness, but I've always felt weird about using them. To me, it's almost like borrowing someone else's creativity, and I much prefer using MIDI that I authored, even if it ends up being forced into an unrecognizable shape. That having been said, you can get some pretty insane results using your own MIDI to trigger the built-in performances. Another way to get crazier and more unpredictable results is by using instruments that use key switches. So, that was a lot to start off with. As a palette cleanser, here are a few less complicated but still fun examples of using plugins the wrong way. Not too long ago, DearVR's parent company Sennheiser gave away all of DearVR's plugins for free, which I'm sure someone in a fancy suit somehow managed to get paid big bucks for. If you're not familiar with DearVR, they were mainly focused on spatial stuff. I've never had any real interest in headphone calibration software because I've been using the same headphones for so long that I know their sound. But what is headphone calibration software, if not an elaborate impulse response and reverb combo? Slapback delay can be nice, but there are just too many contexts where it doesn't feel quite right to me. It kind of gives me this weird sense of depth that's just off enough to bother me, almost like the kind of fake sounding width you get from the Haas effect. But a while back, Sonic Charge gave out the Synplant FX plugin to people who purchased Synplant 2, and I was playing around with it and discovered that I really like it for its ability to do something similar. The secret sauce here seems to be the duck parameter, which acts as a kind of pre-delay for the reverb, and there's always been something about the reverb in Synplant 2 that I really like. Another interesting variation on this is A1 prime delay, which can make its slapback more interesting by pulling a ton of the transient out. Since that transient seems to be a major reason for normal slapback delays feeling so wrong, this is a huge improvement. And as a side note, A1 prime delay pulls out transients in a really interesting way, sounding different than any of the normal transient controllers I've tried. In fact, screw it, I got sidetracked talking about a plugin normally, so this is 100% a transient controller now. Sure, you can't set a delay time faster than 50 milliseconds without adding some latency, but you can just play your clip 50 milliseconds earlier than you would otherwise. Baby Audio's Comeback Kit is another delay that can rein in transients, but it doesn't sound quite as interesting to me. I still prefer the sound to a normal transient controller like Transient Master, but Comeback Kit is much more transparent and less controllable in a way that makes it less interesting. It's the difference between a screwdriver and a wrench with googly eyes. Both can do a job, but they're suited to slightly different jobs, and you're only really going to tell your friends about one of them. I am so bad at EQ. It's always the same story. You start out hearing a problem in your frequency balance and set out armed with an EQ, confident that you'll fix the problem and then be on your merry way. But then you cut the problem and you hear another problem. Then that problem gets addressed and then another one pops up. Deeper and deeper you go down the rabbit hole, fully aware that at some point your ears will become fatigued and start lying to you, but never really being able to tell whether you've already crossed that line in the sand. Then you wake up the next day to the most butchered sound in the world that's somehow even worse than the original signal, and think to yourself, you know what? Maybe I'll just lean into being bad. That way, AI can't ever copy me. This isn't a cope, it's strategic. I think the problem is twofold. First, EQs rarely allow you to make big enough changes. Maybe somebody in $1 billion studio working with the best artists and the best recordings in the world can afford to use a light touch when it comes to EQ, but my stuff is going to require a slightly different approach. I feel like the other part of the problem is that EQs are all about fixing problems, so you're hunting for the bad parts instead of picking out the good parts that are much easier to notice. That's why when I noticed that Isotope's free Ozone 11 EQ has a button conspicuously labeled Delta, my interest was piqued. Delta buttons open many doors for shenanigans. Here's a super old instrument called Atmosphere from the people who made Omnisphere. I love Omnisphere, but Atmosphere's sounds always felt like they needed so much EQ to work that they weren't worth using. But by turning on Delta and cranking the input and output, cuts and boosts will cause sound to bleed through wide parts of the frequency spectrum from silence, allowing you to pick out the parts of the spectrum that are working rather than just mitigating problems. Part of me suspected that being able to use small moves meant that there was less phase shift and that this is why I preferred the sound of EQing this way, but that didn't turn out to be the case. I mean, there's nothing wrong with phase shift, and it apparently goes hand in hand with EQ. I just bring it up to point out that you don't always have to know how something is actually working behind the scenes to know that you like it. But let's be honest, using an EQ to EQ is boring. Vanilla, predictable. My flying bus would be so disappointed if it could see me now. So let's switch gears and try something a little more stupid and self-destructive. Let's stick our hands on the heated stovetop that is OTT and try not to suffer any long-term damage. There are free OTT options like these two, but my personal favorite is Aberrant DSP's Tectonic. If you're not familiar with it, it's a 4-band compressor that lets you choose either downward or upward and downward compression per band. Obviously, we're going to disregard downward compression and stick to the OTT style upward and downward compression and use that to shape the tone of this sound. And there we go. There's just one problem that I have with this compressor, and that's all the compression. Someone should really do something about that. Alright, so I technically used this technique in my Delta video, but it's come to my attention that that video was hard to follow, so this is a fancier version that'll hopefully make more sense despite how intimidating it looks at first glance. First up, we have a dummy effect. Just an effect so light that it's basically free, and all this is doing is copying the left and right signal, which are channels 1 and 2, to an inaudible channel 3 and 4. That's Reaper routing, so this step will almost definitely be different in other DAWs. After that, Tectonic is doing its OTT thing with all of the same settings as before. Then we have my all-time favorite compressor for Comp 2 in Delta Listen mode and set up to use that duplicate signal on 3 and 4 as a sidechain signal. Basically, this thing is working as a gate, using the original signal to force the overly compressed OTT version back closer to its original shape. With the knee cranked up and the release set as fast as it goes, all you have to do is pull up on the threshold to get closer to the original dynamics. Pulling up on the attack carves away the initial transient, which can solve a problem that crops up on some sounds when going overboard with OTT-style compression. There's just a lot of flexibility here. The rest of the chain is just handy stuff that I like to keep around. A light plugin to add volume to match the original signal because the makeup gain in Comp 2 doesn't work in Delta Listen mode. A CPU-friendly EQ doing a low cut because I tested a bunch of them for fixing DC offsets, and this one was the winner. And then a routing plugin that calls channel 3 and 4 so that I have the option of using 3 and 4 in a later chain. This type of chain also tends to benefit from a high-pass filter and/or a low-pass filter at the start of the chain so that you can control how hard you're hitting the highest and lowest bands. Don't think of that as an EQ though, because obviously the compressor is doing the EQ. The high and low pass filter are doing nothing but nudging the OTT compressor in the right direction. I love Reaper so much, but I worked on a few projects with automation early after my switch to it, where the automation points would shift out of place when I wasn't looking. To this day, I have no idea why this happened. I managed to work around it by turning automation into discrete items, but the shifting relationships between automation items and the rest of the automation lanes made it easy to create chaos when moving parts of the track around whenever a song needed to be restructured. And I do a lot of restructuring while building out a song. After some experimenting, I found a way to link effect controls to MIDI velocity values on specific notes, and I can even use notes on MIDI channels that the instrument I'm using doesn't respond to, allowing me to control automation in the same window I'm sequencing in. But manually drawing MIDI? Ugh, this is supposed to be the future. Besides, some instruments either play all MIDI channels as notes or gobble up MIDI before it can be passed down to effects, and the unfortunate solution to this is to create a parent track, which is a bus essentially, and use that to control everything. But then I have to use a separate MIDI track to control effect automation, which kind of defeats the point. It's still more convenient than automation lanes technically, but I'd prefer to solve this in a more unnecessarily roundabout way. This right here is Harmony Bloom. It's a MIDI generator. You would normally use this to spit out MIDI for something like the scalar chains earlier in the video, but instead here it's loaded after the instrument and controlling only the plugin automation. With this button right here enabled, there's random velocity variation, and this ends up working a little bit like a random LFO in sample and hold mode. Of course, here Harmony Bloom is controlling just one effect on one note. Switching between 2 or 3, one after another, isn't really Harmony Bloom's strong point as far as I can tell, so anything more complicated and controlled is going to be more comfortable in a different plugin. This is BlueARP, which is free and awesome. While it's technically an arpeggiator, as the name suggests, it can also create MIDI notes in its drum mode, and that means that it can do all sorts of things like switching between effects by controlling their wet-dry mix. The fun part of this is how much control you're given to go completely crazy and control way more automation than one track could ever possibly need. Another fun thing you can try is using something like Shaperbox to output MIDI. Did you know that Shaperbox can output MIDI using its global audio trigger in the modules? The global audio trigger listens for transient peaks, and that means that any transient loud enough to trigger a note can be used to control an automatable parameter, which in turn means that using a transient controller or compressor to accentuate transient peaks, and then sending the output of that into Shaperbox's sidechain on channels 3 and 4 will provide a lot of control over how notes are being triggered. There are two things worth noticing here. The first is that the MIDI velocity is derived from the loudness of the transient picked up by Shaperbox, which is fun. The second is that the notes coming out of Shaperbox are short, presumably having been intended to work as drum beats. Luckily, there are tools out there that can fill in the gaps and provide some more consistency. Even Waves plugins can be useful. Right here I have TrueVerb, which is one of their reverbs. And now we're going to import the picture of TrueVerb into Aberrant DSP's Digitalis plugin, which will turn it into black and white and use that to determine where and when parts of the frequency spectrum drop out. It just gives sounds a little more movement in life. I only wish that there was some way of inverting the effect so that I could fit this bell sound with this second sound in an interesting way. Ah, there we go. Perfect. You might be asking yourself, why do any of this stuff? To which I'd reply, because it's fun. But also, finding weird ways of doing things can come in handy when you finally do need to work around a pressing issue. For example, the headphone jack in my audio interface fully broke a few days ago. A screw popped off and the internals just fell inside the shell. I know me, and there's zero chance of opening this thing up and fixing whatever's broken in there without breaking something else in the process. Instead, I hooked up an old Line 6 guitar device that can be used as an audio interface, and used OBS and a Reaper plugin to send my DAW and desktop audio to it using the same technique I figured out for getting audio cloned into my little HDMI recorder box. That way, I can borrow the Line 6 device's headphone output without having to use it as my actual audio interface. Most of the legwork was already done, so it wasn't a crushing loss so much as a minor inconvenience, and it's not the first time that figuring out odd ways of using plugins has come in handy when working around a problem. Anyway, I kind of bit off more than I could chew with this video. It didn't help that I avoided using any AI images for this one, but AI in general is starting to feel too gross and morally thorny to bother with. It's hard to justify using something that tech bros are saying things like,
"We must give all the electricity to our AI creations, suffer in darkness human peons,"
about, you know? If you made it this far into the video though, I'd love to know what the consensus is about that sort of thing. I do appreciate AI images for their simplicity, especially given my complete absence of natural talent when it comes to drawing things. And I wouldn't really blink if someone was making a video about something completely different and just generated some dumb AI music as background filler for it, just so long as they weren't trying to pass it off as some original creation or make a ton of money off of it on streaming services or anything sketchy like that. But I just can't shake the weird feeling in my gut that it's a good time to start moving away from all that stuff. Also, weighing in on this complicated moral question means engaging with this video in front of the algorithm, causing it to bestow its favor upon me. That's why people on YouTube so often ask questions and invite you to chime in the comments, and it kinda makes me crazy when no one addresses it. Alright, that'll do it for this video. See you next time, whenever that happens to be.